Hi, class. We're going to be talking about Chapter 5 today. It's good to see all of you, and I'm looking forward to doing this lecture, and hopefully you'll have a few more right after this, not just 5, but I plan on doing Chapters 6 and 7, as well as 8 all today. So just these are, again, just lectures for your own edification. You don't necessarily, there's no assignment that you have to write after the lecture. What you've learned. Hopefully, you guys are getting a lot of the reading done. The book, I feel like the Cunningham and Rich do a very, very good job at explaining philosophy, ideas, and how those ideas influence art. So, in a sense, the course is a good study of humanities and history, as well as religion and philosophy, just as much as if you're looking at some of the pieces. So one of the things I love about teaching this course is that it looks at all of these. I've taught religion in the past. I've also taught philosophy and ethics. Probably one of the things I love about this course in particular is that it seems a lot more holistic in the sense that one problem when you're just teaching philosophy or ethics is that you don't really talk about culture. You don't actually talk about how civilization was being formed and shaped in a variety of ways by these philosophies, by these new or ancient ideas that people talked about or searched for in this during these times. So I want to go ahead and just jump right in. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about Hinduism. Hinduism is a very old religion. It might be one of the probably quite possibly the oldest religion in the world, right up there with Hebraic religion. As far as oldest religion that's still practiced today by millions of followers. Hinduism really got its start in the Indus Valley civilization, and the Indus River in particular, and the Aryans. You can't really understand Buddhism, for example, when we start talking about Buddhism without actually understanding Hinduism, because Buddhism is a sect away from Hinduism. It had some disagreements with Hindu philosophy, as well as what some of the things that Hinduism focused on. And we'll go ahead and preface this right here that Hinduism it tends to focus much more on the physical, and whereas Buddhism tends to focus a little bit more on the spiritual. And you see this a little bit in some of the differences on their temples and what they emphasize. So in Hindu art, you're going to get a lot more. You're going to get a much more of a variety of maybe erotic pieces, whereas Buddhism, you're going to get much more of maybe, I would say, a little bit more of a mundane or aesthetic nature to its pieces. You're going to get a little bit more, you're going to get, I guess, more nuanced and less extreme. So one thing that the book jumps right into is talks about some of these very important writings in Hinduism. Hindu culture was a lot of the religious texts were not written down for thousands of years after its formation. So it's difficult to actually know when Hinduism actually first began. So you have the Mahabharata, which is probably began sometime in the 8th or 9th century BC. It's one of the oldest pieces of oldest poems in the world, and quite possibly the oldest poem in the world. This is where we find the famous poem Bhagavad Gita, which is if you get a chance one of these days, please read Stephen Mitchell's Bhagavad Gita. It's fantastic, really an enlightening read about the warrior god Krishna and his in his battle with whether or not he should take over a particular town, and so it tends to be very metaphysical. It's not necessarily taking me literal per se, but it's actually it starts the conversation, which we'll see in some sects of Christianity as well as Judaism, but especially in Islam, where there's kind of a struggle between flesh and spirit, or the divine and the human. So, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. But the first thing that we have to see is that Hinduism is divided into many gods. There are thousands of gods, quite possibly, matters who you talk to, maybe even more than that. But there are three main gods that are found in Hinduism that are Vishnu, who is the god of order. And this is kind of funny that we'll be talking a lot about order, chaos, and then somebody that goes in between. We talked a little bit about the Egyptian religion and some, as well as some of the ancient Near East religion. When we were talking about how many gods seem to be one seems to get everything in together, kind of a manager role. Another god that seems to come in and just kind of break everything apart. Another god that tends to kind of get in there and just kind of solve the issue, which is really kind of fascinating when you think about the psyche, the id, the ego, and the superego. Or modern psychologists would even say parts of us that are managers likes order, and other parts of us that are called firefighters that likes to just go and escape and create chaos, whether it be watching excessive television, whether it's having unprotected sex. If for some people that could be very dangerous, or it's your drug use, whatever it is, or it could be work. A variety of issues of how we escape. And why is there desire to escape? It's usually a desire to escape after working so hard because there's a sense of shame. That really, so one thing, say what you will about a lot of these ancient religions, they really did it was more of they understood the psyche, and I think they were trying the best they could by the representation of some of these gods to understand how we are made, what are we made of, what are we to worship, and the only thing that I have that I can make sense is myself, in a sense. Self of my sense. And that's about it in my community. And I see these struggles, and so therefore were the gods like this as well. And so that in Hinduism, there's these three gods, Vishnu, Shiva, and Brahma. So if you look on Shiva is the god of dance, and she is found in your book 5.4. But Shiva is known as, let me back up. So Vishnu is regarded as the preserver of the universe. He is kind of like the god of all gods. He is like the Zeus, I suppose. Shiva is known as the god of destruction, but also of creation as well, and philosophy. So not only does she come in and destroy, but she also comes in and creates as well. She does a little bit of both. And then afterwards, it's going to be Brahma. After that, where he is also the kind of the god of creation, the god of order after basically the chaos occurs. So those are the three most important gods that you need to understand when it comes to Hinduism, and every god is kind of an extension from those three main gods. But Hinduism tends to focus on three main practices: aestheticism, karma, and devotion. This is where, again, when we start talking about Buddhism, there's going to be some differences on the way Buddhist philosophers or teachers or monks, where they go rather than our Hindu friends, what they emphasize. So asceticism is this is where actually yoga was first developed through Hinduism. It's actually asceticism is anything that tells your body to refrain. So when you think of yoga, yoga is actually a refrain from getting into maybe rather than having your mind become too engaged. Yoga is actually asking your mind, in a sense, to hold back or take a breath, or take some space. So it's this idea that asceticism is often misunderstood. A lot of people think of it as just like not doing things. And that's not necessarily how asceticism should be viewed. Asceticism is actually viewed in a way that it's you should refrain from maybe sexual activity, or refrain from food, or refrain from particular things that you're very engaged in, to actually give your body, in a sense, a break so that it can recover. And Hinduism saw that asceticism was very important because you become more, quote, enlightened. And there's actually, there's a little bit of truth to that. I don't know if you've ever been to the ocean after a very, very busy week. You ever notice that right when you go on vacation, for example, it takes you like 2 or 3 days to finally just get your mind somewhat relaxed, and then another 2 or 3 days just to finally like enjoy your company. And then by the time at the end of the week comes, you have to go back home and get back to work. It's a very, very frustrating process. So Hinduism, there's some truth to that asceticism, what was known as, to practice these kind of breaks in your life more and more so that you don't become so engaged with constant activity. as though they saw that asceticism was very important to enlightenment in the sense that I understand things a lot better. Philosophers, there's actually neuroscience has done excessive, I could say this as a clinician, has actually done excessive research lately on the use of mindfulness, for example, or yoga, or breathing, or practice. When you learn to actually give your mind breaks throughout the day, whether it's 2 minutes, whether it's 5 minutes, whether it's 10 minutes, you are actually you're often a lot less anxious. You're actually a lot less you're a lot less prone to get angry in the moment. You're much more patient. You enjoy the here and now. You enjoy people's company a little bit more. And they've proven that when your brain is constantly on the go, you're more prone to particular addictions that may be in your life, or becoming more emotionally dysregulated, I suppose. And even neuroscientists have proven that good yoga, good practice, good breathing could actually really help your mind. There's actually, I'm going to keep going if that's okay, because this is my field, but I want to keep talking about this, but it's just kind of, so I sometimes go to these events at Harvard University on mindfulness, and it's one thing that they don't really talk about, where it's kind of like a secret in the psychological field, is that they've also proven that people that practice mindfulness don't actually need psychotropic medications as much, which is actually, believe it or not, angering a lot of psychiatrists. I mean, think about, you're going to med school after 4 years of med school and then 3 years of residency, and you're literally being paid to medicate people. And now they're seeing these studies come out that are actually saying that if you can teach people mindful techniques, or yoga, or just basic breathing techniques, the likelihood of them actually getting on medicine goes down drastically. It's kind of scary stuff with the psychiatric community, because it's like, do I tell people that and then lose a ton of business? Or maybe I should just, say, well, you need to do mindful techniques, but make sure you take your pills. So just a little fun debate, or maybe concerning debate that's in the psychodynamic field a little bit. So anyway, just wanted to throw that in there. But another thing too, so asceticism is very important. A lot of people take that word asceticism, again, it's just kind of like, turning on, like becoming a monk and refraining from all activity, which can occur, and that's where Buddhism is going to come in. But again, generally, it's just refraining so that you can engage and become more enlightened with your activity. The second discipline, I'll try to make this a little bit more brief, is karma. Again, this is another misunderstood term. A lot of people think karma. I'm sure you've heard karma. My wife got me this cup. She went to Chicago. She got me a Starbucks cup from Chicago. I'm drinking Starbucks coffee. Not a big Dunkin' fan. I don't know why they're even in business. Their donuts are terrible. You guys need some Krispy Kreme. My goodness. Anyway, so no, but karma is one of those things that often gets misunderstood. Karma is not what I usually. Well, let me back up. So where I usually hear karma, the word karma is probably very similar to the way you hear the word karma, which is, it's I did something bad in the past, and karma's going to come get me. I was mean to my wife, and my wife's going to eventually be mean to me. Something like that. I'm sure you've probably heard that the word used that way. That's actually that's not how Hindus often use the word. Hindus don't necessarily see it as a tit for tat relationship, in the sense that, okay, I do this good thing and then this good thing comes back. I do this bad thing and then this bad thing comes back. That's actually more of an American version of karma. Karma is actually seen as like a path or a discipline of life. So Hindus don't assume that you're perfect. They actually see that you're quite flawed and you do the best you can. But karma is more of like the way you've lived your life, the path that you're on, the karma that you choose. So they see it as much more of like a wrestling, like a warrior is a very good a metaphor for this, because when you think of a warrior, he doesn't start out immediately being able to beat up tons of people or destroy all these other warriors. No, he has to start out with just a basic. Think of Karate Kid, just like wax on, wax off. He starts very, very basic. But as he continues with the discipline of knowing how to be a warrior, eventually he becomes very skilled in his task. So karma is more being patient. Think of the asceticism comes in to close my mind a little bit from the busyness so that I can focus. It's being able to focus on a particular task, but not only be able to focus on a particular task, but to endure. That's the most important thing with karma. It's basically not giving up. It's enduring for as long as I possibly can. So if you're a parent, for example, it's you're going to have lots of nights where you're going to lose your patience. This is why the American version is so flawed, because it's not like I've seen, actually, it's funny because as a psychiatrist, I actually see psychologists, I actually see patients come in and they feel bad for something they did when, their kid just provoked them at, and they were just waking up and they just kind of yelled or something, and then they feel terrible still from this memory. And you could see it as the excessive guilt when that American version of karma actually comes in. They just carry it. Well, the Hindu version actually says, well, that doesn't matter. It's okay, fine, you did something bad. It's more, okay, fine, you did something, it was a bad morning, but how do you persevere? Are you going to keep going? Are you going to keep doing it? Yep. And that's actually is what's the most important thing, that I choose the path and I stay on the path, regardless of the discouragements that I may face and regardless of the encouragements that I may face. So sometimes people get too prideful, for example. They get praised too much. And that actually drives people off from their karma. God drives people off from their path, because when they get praised too much, they slow down and they get kind of laxative. Laxatical. Excuse me, laxative is something you take in your stomach. It's still early in the morning, by the way. But they get laxatical and just lazy, I suppose, and then they stop working. So the most important thing is that you stay on path, you stay on task. And finally, the third thing is devotion. And devotion refers to all the deeds, devoted to the gods, doing things not out of a trap of self-centeredness or greed, but to do things with a desire to actually please the gods because I love the gods, that kind of attitude. So to always be kind of like checking your own heart as well. But those are the three things. And the reason why I kind of focus a lot on that is because when you look at all this Hebrew art, and there's a lot of it, those are the three themes that are often being, exposed, I suppose. So if you look at the Shiva, for example, the king of the dance, you in a sense can see all three of those. You see the path or the circle. So that's what's that? That's karma. But you also see, in a sense, asceticism. This god is, in a sense, withholding from touching too much. You notice that the foot is actually on the bottom, and so it's touching the ground. But notice the other foot is actually lifting off, so it's not touching. Both feet are not touching. Notice the god's hands. Same thing. Two hands are up front, kind of away. So I'm gonna, one is kind of like pushing away in a sense, but also accepting, a little bit of both. But two are actually extended outward. So you see that view of asceticism. I'm not going to get too close for you. I'm going to get away back. I'm going to find a little bit of space between us. And then finally, devotion. Well, this is the God. This is the God that we are to devote. We are to model ourselves after. And so when you look at all this Hebrew art, for the most part, they're going to be kind of focusing on this. You could read a little bit about the Bhagavad Gita. I have taught on the Bhagavad Gita, but just for the sake of time, like I said, it's basically Krishna, who's the incarnation, the preserver god Vishnu, and he has this it's a conversation on whether or not he should fight in this battle. And it's really a beautiful story, because he has all these doubts and all these concerns. Should I fight? Should I go in? He feels cowardly. He feels like there's no point in actually fighting. He feels like he gets distracted. All of these things. But at the end of the poem, he actually goes in and starts fighting. And that's karma. I get distracted. I don't really want to be a parent. I don't want to be a student. I don't really want to do this. That's not the point. It's not that tit for tat karma. It's, at the end of the day, I'm going to do it. I'm going to take on all of these emotions, but that's not going to prevent me from actually going in and preserving for my life. Real quick, I just feel like I have to say this. So as a marriage counselor, as a family counselor, if you ever are a dad, or if you are a parent, can I say something really quick on that? On just like what karma actually represents? Because I actually think this is really important. I want to take this in. So if you're a parent, they've actually, if I can go back to science and done some studies and stuff like that, kids don't remember the bad things that you've done as a mom and dad, the individual bad things per se. What they often remember much more so is the path that you took their whole lives. And then they put those, quote, times you lost your patience, times you got upset, times you yelled. So if the path you took was generally hands off and just like you were never really engaged, or maybe you were overworking, then they're going to take those, quote, things that you may have done, losing patience, and then they're going to put it on that theme. And that is what they're going to remember about you. But I know that many of you are probably very loving people and loving parents and everything else. So turning that around, it's not so much the times that we actually lost our patience or times that we spoke out or whatnot. It's the path that I've chosen to give to my child. I have 3 kids, by the way, 2 daughters and 1 little boy. The path that I'm going to choose to love them every single day and be the best I possibly can, which I hope to tell myself almost every single day. That is what kids actually remember. It's the path that you take. It's not so much the little tiny mistakes that you may have done. It's that. That can be very comforting, I feel. I just really do. So anyway, so that's Hinduism, and in the most part, and you can read about some of the philosophies and whatnot. Now, this differs from Buddhism. So let me talk a little bit about Buddhism. Buddhism came out mainly because the extremes of Hinduism. So Hinduism in its purest form could offer a lot of good, but there were extremes of Hindu philosophers, Hindu thought. One thing that we did not talk about is Hinduism has this very strong idea of a caste system. So it's a hierarchical caste system. I mean, so they had this view that the more aesthetic you became, the more, and they also have this high view of reincarnation. So people who were very, very devoted in their aesthetic lifestyle, who were also chose a positive path of karma, and they were very devoted to the gods, they would then get reincarnated, and the way they would get reincarnated determined where they were on the success scale. So one thing about Hinduism is that if you were born into a very rich family, a prominent family, the assumption, and this is still true in a lot of Hindu thought, even though it's gone down quite a bit since Gandhi in the early 20th century. So they have this view of people who are, quote, the untouchables. And the untouchables, the assumption of most of the community was these are people who have been reincarnated, and these reincarnated people didn't live good lives. And so therefore they're untouchable in the sense that we should kind of push them out. And so that was the assumption that a lot of Hindu priests, and that's where the religion goes with that. So it's very, very hierarchical. And so Buddhism comes along, and it had a lot of problems with that for, I guess, obvious reasons, matters who you talk to. But it didn't. Buddha, Siddhartha Buddha, actually grew up at a very prominent. He was very wealthy when he first when he was born, and when he was born, he decided to search out, like, what is the meaning of life, and he was very influenced by Hinduism, and he decided to search out the meaning of life by 2 extremes. Number one, the extreme aesthetic way. So what he tried to do is he refrained from eating. He fasted for I think 30 or 40 days or something like that. He didn't sleep for a number of days. He tried and tried and tried to be aesthetic as he possibly could. And what Buddha realized is that didn't matter how aesthetic he became, it didn't seem like true enlightenment actually occurred. And so he gave that up. And when he gave that up, he was actually very, he lost a lot from that, because a lot of people actually thought that was the way to salvation, if I give up on a whole lot of stuff. Sorry about that. And so if I give up a significant amount of my own disciplines or whatnot, or excuse me, if I give up, the things that I want, like whether it's sexual activity, whatnot, then enlightenment should come. And, that's actually kind of a general view of salvation. A lot of people think that. A lot of people think, okay, if I refrain from all this stuff, then I'm going to kind of all of a sudden get some kind of enlightenment. And Buddha did that to the extreme, to the utter extreme. He was very, very aesthetic. And what he realized is that I'm not really getting anything. He also tried the other way, okay? He tried living this very decadent, lascivious. He had this very lascivious life, having sex a lot, doing all the. I think he was doing some shrooms. So, and he found just through sexual pleasure and all these other things that actually wasn't very enlightening either. He actually became even more depressed. And what Buddha realized is that these two extreme life is not about extremes, and this is why this explains a lot of the art. It tends to be a little bit more simplistic. It's more found from within. That Buddha realized that salvation, per se, is found inside here, inside yourself. Now, I just caught myself. So Buddhism actually doesn't believe in a self, per se. It just feels like enlightenment is actually in my inner being, nor does it really believe in a soul, but is found from within. That's the one little thing I didn't actually specify. The difference between Hinduism and Buddhism, one main difference, is that Hinduism believes that we are directly connected to the gods, and that we have something called an Atman or Altman, Atman, and that is a direct connection to the gods, and that the self inside of us, this is Hinduism, by the way, grows as that connection through asceticism as well as through devotion and karma. The more that grows, that connection gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and our connection with God and self then gets bigger and wider. Buddhism didn't believe that. Buddhism actually cut the self out of the equation and said that enlightenment is not found in all these extremes. It's found in inner peace. And so that's going to be the main tenets of Buddhism. And there are, so there are four noble truths of Buddhism. I'm going to see if I can do this without looking at my notes. So this is what, after Buddha, he realized, after he decided not to go to the ascetic route, lost a lot of prophets or a lot of disciples that way, not to go to the lascivious route. May have lost some people that way too. He just decided to meditate under a tree for hours and hours. He was still eating, still partaking in the here and now. And then he supposedly came up with this enlightened way of knowing how the quote, in other words, how the world works. And it's actually quite fascinating, the things he observed. So he became enlightened, and he really found this, he would say, within. Buddhism, it doesn't really have a very high view of God. Some Buddhists believe in God, some don't. It's more kind of like this energy, per se. But the very first tenet of Buddhism is life is suffering. So that's where it starts out with. Dukkha, I believe dukkha, excuse me. We can feel, and this was Buddha. He tried life. He tried living life. These two extremes, couldn't find happiness anywhere. And the reason for that is because there's just this general view of suffering. Isn't that applicable to today? How many of us, whether it's ourselves or we know people that try to live both of these routes, and they just can't find happiness. There really is an angst or a despair, an existential despair that we see even today, whether you're on Facebook, whether you're on social media. There's a sadness, and Buddha recognized that. Buddha recognized that there's generally a real suffering that goes on. So it's not power of positive thinking that everybody's doing grand and everybody's wonderful. It's nothing like that. Buddhism tends to be a lot more honest. No, there's suffering. There's a lot of garbage, and there's hurt, and there's pain, and there's trauma, and that's life. And so Buddhism takes that and sees that as just a pure reality. But the causes of suffering, and then Buddha realizes, well, what's the causes of this suffering? Well, anger, attachment, I have to look, and ignorance. Ignorance is not so much not being able to read or naivete. It's more, ignorance is choosing to stay ignorant. So it's anger, attachment, and attachment is more kind of like the person that can't let go. And that's where he would say that's where suffering really occurs. It's people that want to stay really, really attached. And the minute somebody tries to have some space in the relationship, they just immediately freak out. Somebody that's very, very attached to their money, and the minute maybe their bank account loses $1,000, even though everything seems fine, their anxiety just shoots up. So Buddha was really quite profound. When he was going to the marketplace and everything else, he just noticed that people just held on to things, very material things. And he said that actually causes a lot of suffering. That causes a lot of greed. It causes anger. It causes anxiety. It causes pain. It causes lack of boundaries, all of these things. And so this attachment and then anger often stems from that, because then anger usually comes from a fear of not being able to have what I feel like that is rightfully mine. And that word mine is very, very key. Buddhism would say that that's not yours. It's his or hers, or maybe the nature's, or it's the wind, it's the fire, and so while Buddhism has these two views of both attachment, anger, then stems from that over attachment, and then what happens to us when we become very, very attached, then we become angry. What happens? We become ignorant. We become naive. As social psychologists would say, we become consumed with our own confirmation bias. Confirmation bias just basically says that I'm going to prove to myself that what I'm doing is right, or prove to myself that everybody else is wrong. So it could be a person that holds on really, really, really strong to maybe a political position, and then gets angry if somebody in his family might take a different political position. And then this person is confirming with his own bias why my political position is so correct and why they're so wrong. But it could also be a mother who is very, very, very attached. I like to call, maybe the Oedipal mother, coming from the play Oedipus. The Oedipal mother that literally holds on so tight to her son or to her child, even when he's older, and she fears so much by the time he's 23, 24, just getting married. She can't let go, and she gets so angry, and so she becomes very ignorant in the Buddhist sense, confirmation biased. This woman that he's trying to marry is so evil and so wrong, and she's not good for the family, even though everybody from the outside who aren't attached are like, she's actually pretty cool, She works at Starbucks, not Dunkin' Donuts. But so I'm trying to make this as relatable as I can. So Buddha understood that that's where a lot of suffering comes from. Oh, I love that. I mean, I'm not a Buddhist. I'm not, but if I could be kind of Buddhist for 5 seconds, man, I don't know if he got enlightenment, but I don't know, whether he got enlightenment under the Bodhi tree or not. That is probably, in my opinion, one of the most, with the exception of Jesus's golden rule, that's right up there as probably the best observation of humanity I think I've ever read, in my opinion. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. The more you think about it, really, really let that sink in. So Buddha understood those two things, and then finally I said 4 noble truths. The third, suffering can end. There is ability to end this over attachment, this anger, and then this ignorance when we enter a state of nirvana. Nirvana is another. It's not a band. I mean, well, it is, but it's not. But nirvana is one of those overused words I think a lot of people generally don't understand. But nirvana is really it's teaching yourself to let go, focusing on breath, focusing on the here and now, and teaching myself to not be as attached. And nirvana is a state of, quote, emptiness. So what Buddhism doesn't really teach a way of salvation, it basically teaches what the monks do, is it's a whole life of letting go, just letting go. And that's what it is, and letting be. This is also going to be very, very influenced. It's also going to influence Taoism and Confucianism, or more Taoism. So we see some early forms. And then finally, the fourth noble truth. One can help others in suffering through the Eightfold Path. I won't read all of those, but basically it's righteous living, right speech, making sure you don't lie, maintaining a calm, attentive state of mind. It's a beautiful kind of ethic per se on, right understanding, right living, trying not to hurt others, not killing, not lying, not avoiding jealousy. So Buddha then offers kind of a way or a path to salvation that by trying these Eightfold Paths, and to slowly then kind of detach yourself from these things. So I know I talked a lot about the religions here, and I wanted to for a moment because you could already see all of the different temples, for example. So if you look at, so going back on the, if you turn the page, I think on 179, here are some, this is some Hindu temples, for example, and 510 really kind of jumps out to me. This is this is actually, it's an openly erotic subjects of many of these reliefs. And so the reason why I point that out is because Hinduism had a very erotic kind of view of the gods. And it wasn't erotic in the sense like everyone was having all this sex whenever they were worshiping. It wasn't that per se. It was more they thought that the gods were much more in line with the human than Buddhism did. And it was, as you can see, it's Hindu art tends to be a lot more openly erotic, and that reflected belief of pious Hindus that sexual union, actually, they also saw that sexual union represented kind of a union to their gods. That's what they saw sexual union as. It was like coming together with the gods as well. Again, think of that self and then connecting with the gods, per se. Which is going to be very different from Buddhist thought. If you turn the page in 512, if you compare and make a contrast between the erotic Hindu art versus the Buddhist art, if you look at 512, very simple. Buddha is in his stance, but you notice that both feet, both of his legs are actually on the ground. So he is here, he's present. His hand is also on the ground. But he's open. Where is he open? It's generally open to his heart, not so much extended outward, but his salvation is in a sense found within. And so those are the things that you really want to look for when you're looking at and you're comparing, you're contrasting these two religions, and it just makes a lot more sense when you look at all their temples, when you look at all the different art, when you look at the sculptures. Those are some of the things that they're really going to focus on. I want to end though on Confucianism and Taoism. One thing, just real quick, Confucius, I won't go into quite as much detail or in depth as Buddhism and Hinduism, but Confucius was a prophet, probably lived around the time of, maybe the time of Lao Tzu, who is the founder of Taoism, or the Way. And Confucius believed that basically it was a 5 plus 2. Confucius he tended to be a lot more traditional. Confucius believed in 5 inner virtues, and so righteousness, inner integrity, love of humanity, altruism, and loyalty, and that the way these inner virtues are developed are through external virtues as well, by having a very high view of culture, but as well as a high view of education and ritual. So Confucius and Confucianism is going to have a significant impact on the way the youth, in particular in China and Asia, view the elderly, for example. And you still see this today. I've spent some time in China, actually about 10 years ago. I was amazed at the vast difference between American culture and Chinese culture. In Chinese culture, whenever a elderly person, anybody who's over 50, passes you by, it's very polite in Chinese culture to stop. Always let the person go in front of you. Even do a little bow to the people who are over 80 to bow and to show significant respect. Very humbling. They treat their elderly so much better than we treat our elderly here. If I can go on a tangent right here. I mean, one of the most horrific things I think in American culture is elderly homes. It's just horrific. I mean, I used to volunteer for my church, and we used to go to elderly communities. And basically, in America, when your parent gets old, you drop them off and leave them alone, and you go visit on holidays. It's a horrific way, and the way we treat our elderly. In contrast to the Chinese culture that just honors the elderly so much more. We in American society probably tend to idolize youth. The problem with that, when you idolize the youth, is that one day you get old, and then when you continue to teach that to your young, they then don't like you. So you have to be really careful with that philosophy when you idolize the youth, because the youth, you will no longer be young. And when you are old, the youth, if you continue to teach that philosophy and adhere to that philosophy, will then turn their back on you. So it's a very self-defeating thing that we see often in American culture. Idolize the child or idolize the youth and just put the elderly way down here. And Yes, we're seeing that with the baby boomers. In the next 5 years, baby boomers are all retiring, and so how are we going to treat them? But baby boomers also significantly made a huge impact on our culture by idolizing youth. So what are they going to do? So hopefully we don't continue that philosophy. We can maybe be influenced by Chinese philosophy to really honor them. Anyway, that's me. Sorry for preaching, but Confucian really taught that these virtues do come from ritual, come from tradition. So they had a very, very, very high view of tradition. Now Taoism takes a little bit different of a stance. It definitely respects tradition, but Taoism, Confucius was much more, I should say this, Confucius was very much engaged, so he was much more political. He believed a lot more in kind of a feudal system, knights, and kind of a hierarchy of different people who were in the government to take care of you, who believed in monarchy. So Confucius would focus a lot more on hierarchy, like people that are up here were to influence the people below them. Taoism took a very different stance. Taoism, or the way, felt like we should. It was almost in a sense, it wasn't pure anarchist, but it had a very high suspicion of anything that was government related. So if I could do it like this, Confucianism was much more like your hardcore Democrat, old school Democrat, that they felt like government had to grow or get a lot bigger. Not today's Democrat, but probably old school Democrat. Well, the only difference being that it had also a high view of the elderly. That's Confucius. Whereas Taoism, think of it as like you're kind of like your libertarian, who kind of thinks anything that's government related needs to leave me alone. Just let things express themselves naturally. Not the greatest example, not the greatest metaphor, but I think it kind of works, and some just kind of wets the palate a little bit as far as knowing some of the differences. Taoism had a much more of a hands-off approach, you could say. And you read that a lot in some of the writings. So the important thing of what you're looking for, and you see this in the contrast between Confucius as well as Taoist thinking, is that if you notice, I'll just kind of turn all the way to page 194. So if you look at, you could immediately tell on page 531 that hanging scroll is going to be what? A Confucius or a Taoist scroll. So I just explained to you the philosophies a little bit. Hopefully you just said Taoist. This can be much more influenced by Taoism because it's the way. I'm going to let things be. I'm going to let things naturally explain themselves. So I'm going to copy nature as much as I can so that the natural life or the natural river flows its representative is pure in itself. And I don't have to add to that. Let things just kind of, it's somewhat Buddhist in the sense of letting things go and letting things be. So it's a little bit longer of a lecture this time. I had a lot of ideas to kind of explain. So this is chapter 5. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing you for chapter 6.